It's time for Agriculture, presented by Turkana Farms in Germantown, New York, a small-scale producer of heritage breed livestock and a wide array of vegetables and berries on just over 39 acres. They also produce a full array of garden vegetables, many of them heirloom varieties raised naturally, as well as an assortment of berries, including raspberries, blackberries, gooseberries, black, red, and white currants, mulberries, and elderberries. And now, here's Mark Scherzer.
Death happens on the farm with some regularity, whether planned or not, and I am therefore somewhat inured to it. It's useful to be reminded through the presence of others that just shrugging and going on is not the universal reaction. To be sure, this doe's death was unusual enough in its circumstances, one might call it a pedestrian accident, that I was likely to take special note. My friend Eric, who's been visiting for the last week, took a break from his remote work just before lunch Friday to commune with his dog, Lillie, and take a little stroll. He went along the driveway to see the spectacular display of Sir Thomas Lipton white roses that haven't bloomed this profusely since we moved them from our Sag Harbor garden 20 years ago. Just as Eric rounded the curve where the roses are showing themselves off, he saw in the middle of the oval lawn that's framed by the driveway a young doe, grazing, and she saw him. What had been a peaceful moment in a previously ungrazed virgin perennial border apparently turned to terror for her. She began to run in the direction from which she had entered. Upon realizing that she was running directly toward Eric, she did an about-face and ran in the other direction, toward the field on the other side of the deer fence. Unfortunately, the fence, at an 8-foot height designed to keep deer out, is also effective at keeping them in. She ran into the fence, and it deflected her. She made a second, more forceful attempt, bounced back, and collapsed on the ground. Eric came in to get me, and together we tried to determine whether she was alive. Our conclusion, barely breathing. We thought she was perhaps in shock, and that if we gave her space and some time, she might recover and walk out of the nearby driveway gate, which I opened for that purpose. We tried to give her some water, to which she did not respond. We brought Lillie inside the house to ensure that her canine hunting instincts were not practiced on the doe, and we began to do a little research. An online list of large animal wildlife rehabilitators turned up nobody nearby. I called the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Region 4 Wildlife phone. The person answering the phone said she had heard many deer injury stories in the last year, plus she had been working that job, but this one was a new one. She connected me to the State Biologist for this region. The biologist told me that while the circumstances of the accident were indeed unusual, deer deaths, like those of turkeys and, in her opinion, sheep, could be triggered by events that to humans seem quite minor. I told her I knew what she meant about turkeys, who when we raised them seemed to come up with innumerable creative ways to die, but that my Karakul sheep were incredibly hardy and I would not put them in the same category. In any event, she suggested that the doe could either have broken her neck, hitting the fence, or suffered from heart failure brought on by the stress of the situation. Either way, the prognosis did not seem good. I asked her what to do with the carcass if the doe died. Should I bury it? She said I could, but strongly suggested that if I had woods nearby, I should take the carcass out there, far from the house, and leave it as a source of food for eagles and other wildlife desperately searching for food for their young this season. She clearly sees the role of wildlife in an ecosystem as opposed to their place in human sensibilities. A couple of hours later, it was clear that the doe had died, and Eric and I lifted her into a wheelbarrow and trundled her out to the edge of the woods along the back pasture, about halfway between my house and the nearest neighbor. I think it's fair to say that Eric was traumatized. As we took her out to the woods, Eric kept muttering, "Poor soul, poor soul." He blamed himself for causing her death by his innocent lunch-hour stroll. In fact, the blame was far more mine for having left open a gate to the chicken run due east of the driveway. I had wanted the sheep to graze it down before I started raising chickens there and forgot to close it back up, allowing the doe to enter from the pasture. It pains me to admit that it took Eric's reaction to jolt me back to a feeling of remorse and to think about what death meant for this creature. As he spoke of her soul, it occurred to me to consider her psyche. I wondered if, in breaching the fortifications surrounding the garden here, she had felt she had entered a kind of paradise, with delicacies like hosta, roses, lobelias, and peonies free for her delectation, and whether, while blissing out on that feast, the sudden encounter with Eric and Lillie caused her to think, "Oh, bleep, what have I gotten myself into?" I wondered whether one might view the speed of her death, confronted with the sudden uncertainty into which her life was thrown, as a sort of mercy. A bit over a year ago, we were all sent into a kind of shock when the certainties of our lives were shattered by the force of a global pandemic. Most of us adjusted, but maybe we humans need constant reminders of how forces beyond our control shape our lives, and sometimes take them.
Agriculture is underwritten by Turkana Farms, LLC, a small-scale producer of heritage-bred livestock and a wide array of vegetables and berries on just over 39 acres in Germantown, New York. More information, 518-537-3815.